This is the New West, 1865, 1900. This is Michael Gillette, teaches AP US History at Champion High School in Vernon, Texas. So this is one of many of our Gilded Age units connected to the post-Civil War era in US history. So talking about the New West, it's an extension of an earlier unit in APUSH dealing with manifest destiny. So ideally, at the very beginning, Americans had always, as part of their credo, expansionism. It was George Washington who, in his farewell address, advised Americans not to look to the troubles of Europe, but instead to gaze towards the West, that our future was to the West. And so over the course of the pre-Civil War era, Americans had gradually made that trickle across the Appalachian Mountains into the lands beyond the mountains. So we'll look at a bigger, a more important image later on when we look at the map here in a couple of slides. But really, this is a story of the taming of the West, mainly the lands west of the Mississippi. Like much of Western history, a great deal of it has been romanticized through art and literature and music. Of course, this is a great image talking about the movement of Americans into the frontier. There's a lot of, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I want you to take a moment and analyze this image and look at what exactly that as the Americans move west, number one, what is enabling them to move west? Think about technology, think about different innovations making it possible. But think about the clash of cultures between Native American cultures and of course, an American white culture. This could be a big part of the issue. And then think about as white Americans are moving westward, we tend to think about why. What were the push-pull factors that enabled Americans to move west? So looking, of course, this is the United States during the Civil War, and you can see essentially that this unit is called the New West. Now, understanding that there is a New West, then you'd have to assume that there is an Old West. Okay, so the dividing line for us in talking about the history of the West, okay, is the Mississippi River. Okay, as you can see, goes from the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Minnesota. So all the land east of the Mississippi is what we affectionately know as the Old West. Now, in the very beginning, in 1607 at Jamestown, when the English, when they stepped foot onto the shores of what we know today as Virginia, to establish their first colony at Jamestown, they were stepping right into frontier. They were stepping into a land where void of civilization. And so they were essentially beginning something new in a land that had, was very harsh. Right? The frontier is very, very difficult, very, very difficult to survive. So anyway, so you talk about the Old West. The Old West is going to be conquered. Okay, it's going to be conquered, and you think about what have we learned up to this point that enabled Americans, contributed to the Americans and dominate and expanding to this territory. So obviously, I think one major development would be the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase, after all, is going to grant us significant amounts of territory, in which Jefferson, of course, if you recall, saw it as the Empire of Liberty. He first saw a day in which farmers would expand westward into these territories in building of what he wanted, what he called an agrarian empire. Obviously, the Indian Removal Act, 1830, one barrier that prevented Americans from moving west were Native Americans. And Jackson, of course, through that law, is going to help with the national goal of moving all Indians living east of the Mississippi into lands west of the Mississippi. As you can see, Oklahoma Indian Territory is going to be the home of many of these native groups that are going to be moved, some of them along what we refer to as the Trail of Tears. Another important development that is going to enable the American people to tame the Old West. The Old West is the market revolution. Of course, the market revolution, a significant portion or component of the market revolution, is the transportation revolution, the steamship, the building of turnpikes, canals, and eventually the railroad is going to enable Americans to get across the Appalachian Mountains and move into the territories west of that barrier. So talking about the New West, all right, the New West is going to be the land, the territory located west of the Mississippi, okay? And early, prior to the U.S. Civil War, Americans had been gradually moving into the territories of the West. We've got, for example, obviously what helps pave the way for the beginning of American pioneers moving across this desolate territory would be Lewis and Clark. Remember, it was Lewis and Clark in 1806, 07, who's going to essentially map and chart the much of this territory going all the way to Oregon, the Oregon country. And so beginning in the 1810s and well into the 1820s, you're going to find thousands of Americans moving, going across the Great Plains and into the lands of the Pacific Northwest up here. Another important migration prior to the Civil War out of Illinois, Nauvoo, Illinois, would be Brigham Young and the Mormons, who are going to move across. They're going to take what was called the Mormon Trek in the 1840s and move to the banks of the Great Salt Lake, where they're going to establish their utopian society, their Mormon capital, the banks of the Great Salt Lake. You also have, prior to the Civil War, you have thousands of Americans moving across the fruited plain into California, okay? Especially in 1849, once gold is found in California. We've got Americans moving into Texas, all right? Moving into Texas, and of course, the settlement of Anglos in Texas eventually eventually resulted in a series of events leading to the Texas Revolution. So the bottom line is that by the end of the U.S. Civil War, there are Americans that are living west of the Mississippi, but you're going to see a significant increase in interest and by not just individual Americans, but by the United States government in establishing the land, establishing and migrating into these territories in the what we call the New West. the land west of the Mississippi. So the Great West, as is often referred to, spanned from the Great Plains to the California desert. The area was largely inhabited by nomadic tribes, Plains Indians, and you can see important examples from the Sioux, the Comanche, the southwestern peoples, such as the Apache and the Navajos, and the northwestern groups, such as the Nez Perce and the Shoshone. By 1890, the entire area had been carved into states except for 4 territories. And during the period, pioneers are going to pour into this vast area and one of the most rapid settlements in all of human history. Expansion was spurred by among things, the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad, which we will address here in a few minutes. So the story of frontier is central to the American story. From day one, when the first Brits arrived during the colonial period, the story of America is the story of a free people attempting to tame the wild frontier. And so an American historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner is going to present a thesis, a very famous thesis. He presented this thesis in 1893, in which he helps explain the importance of frontier in the development of the United States, the development of the United States, its economy, but also the influence that frontier had in the development of American character, the American character, American values and virtues. And so in a separate PowerPoint or in a separate YouTube, I'm going to, I go over the significance of the frontier from Frederick Jackson Turner's point of view. I think for AP students, I think it's important to note that on the AP exam, Frederick Jackson Turner is likely going to be one of the most tested concepts coming from this unit. So it's very important that you spend a good deal of time analyzing what his thesis was, what's the central idea, and then what impact did the frontier have on the development of American history, on the development of America, and the influence it had in influencing the development of a unique American culture. I will go ahead and say now that it was, in a way, Frederick Jackson Turner makes an important argument that there's a reason why Europeans and Americans are different. And what made Americans distinctive, what makes Americans distinctive and unique from our European counterparts, is that the United States has frontier. It had frontier. As the United States was developing, Americans were constantly having to deal with the challenges of taming the Wild West. And in doing so, they became distinctive. They adopted traits that Europeans generally do not possess. So we talked about the Old West versus New West. Historian Walker Prescott Webb wrote that it was as if east of the Mississippi, civilization stood on 3 legs: land, water, and timber. And west of the Mississippi, not one, but 2 of these legs disappear: water and timber. And civilization was left on 1 leg: land. All right, so think about the 3-legged stool, and that it was, if you look here, east of the Mississippi River, The land, the frontier east of the Mississippi, had water. It had abundant sources of land and resources and timber. And as long as you have those three elements, it was easier for Americans to tame the frontier. It was easy to survive. With timber, you're allowed to build shelter. You could build fences. You could clear the land. You can plant. You can grow because the climate is not arid. The soil is fertile, and you're close enough to the east, and there are plentiful amounts of or numbers of rivers with which to transport and to move from place to place east of the Mississippi. Now, if you look west of the Mississippi, it's much, much more difficult. Thriving and surviving in the frontier west of the Mississippi is much, much more difficult. And it's a big reason why, and I think it's important that you pay attention here, is that when early Americans crossed the Mississippi River to settle beyond it, they, by and large, they bypassed the Great Plains. Like they chose not to settle here. In fact, they bypassed it and went into the Pacific Northwest. They bypassed it by going into California, and they bypassed it by going into Texas. And it's in part because at the time they referred to the Great Plains area as what was called the Great American Desert. The Great American Desert was named such because of the scarcity of water and timber. And many Americans viewed because it was arid and because it lacked trees, it rendered the land useless. Like you can't survive. You can't survive because of the lack of those two important elements. And so that's why for much of the history, American of the West, Americans simply avoided the Great Plains. And so if we're going to move the Native Americans out of the East and we're going to relocate them west of the Mississippi, where do they put them? In the plains, where they hunted buffalo and they lived off the land and where they lived basically a nomadic lifestyle. And it was okay to give the Indians the territory here because it was viewed that the territory was not suitable for white settlement. So kind of going to the beginning, the New West, as it says here, the great epics of the Civil War and Reconstruction were remote events, hardly touching the lives of Indians, Mexicans, Asians, trappers, miners, and Mormons scattered throughout the plains and mountains. The lust for land and profits pushed Americans to fulfill the manifest destiny outlined by John Lewis O'Sullivan in 1845. And originally, the Americans were content to allow the Indians to occupy the lands of the West. So while the Civil War and Reconstruction was going on, there wasn't a whole lot of the people who were living west of the Mississippi were distant from those events and not really connected. Okay. So there's one of two ways we can look at the history of the West. There's two, as I say up here, there's two, I need a little typo there, divergent storylines. There's one of two ways you can look at the story of the New West. And I think if we're going to be intellectually honest with each other, I think we have to understand that the story of the West is actually both of these stories. Okay, there's two different components to it. Number one, the first storyline is that the settlement of the West beyond the Mississippi constituted a colorful drama of determined pioneers overcoming all obstacles to secure their visions of freedom and opportunity amid the region's awesome vastness. And ultimately, you can view the story as one of triumph and success, of average, ordinary people seeking freedom, seeking land, seeking opportunity, starting their lives over again, braving the elements, braving the harsh geography and the harsh climate, and all the dangers of, associated with the West to ultimately establish new settlements. And so I think if you look at the West, I think you got to look at it as a triumph. It is a triumphant part of our story. However, on the other hand, number two, the colonization of the West was a tragedy of short-sighted greed, irresponsible behavior, a story of reckless exploitation that nearly exterminated the culture of Native Americans, scarred the land, and decimated its wild animals. And from this perspective, you can view the history of the West, but of a tale of hardship, frustration, and failure. So, was the story of the West a triumph or a tragedy? And indeed, it is a tragic story amongst important developments and triumphs of the American people. So I think every APUSH student goes through this unit, and they come out of it with different perspectives on how to view the story of the West, the story of the development of the West. And so I hope that you're able to do this. And talking about the tragedy, this is Chief Bigfoot. This is a chief who was gunned down at the Battle of Wounded Knee, a significant event in this unit. And I think this photograph, I think, is just evidence that the story does have a tragic tone to it. But also you have the triumphant story here of pioneer families braving the desolate, isolated, inhospitable land of the West to try to, in some way, start their lives over. Again, there's two different perspectives here. I'm not necessarily, nor is it my responsibility as an historian, it's not my responsibility to present only one perspective of the story of the West. I will ingrain the two storylines into one story. So for a long time, the region of the New West had been called the Great American Desert, a barrier to cross on the way to the Pacific, unfit for human habitation, and therefore, to white Americans, the perfect refuge for Indians. But this changed during the last half of the 19th century. So going into the Gilded Age period, this attitude about the Great American Desert began to change. And what we're going to see from 1865 to 1900 is a great deal of increased interest in what was happening west of the Mississippi. One, we're going to find there will be new finds of gold and silver. Obviously, that's going to be the number one draw of migrants to the West, are the various gold rushes and other rushes in pursuit of precious metals. Two, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, destruction of the buffalo, the collapse of Indian resistance, the rise of the range cattle industry, and the introduction of dry farming techniques and irrigation that would make the land fruitful after all. So by 1876, I picked this map for a reason, I think, because this is the centennial, right? So 1876 is the 100th birthday of the United States, dating back to, or at least the 100th anniversary of July, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th. So this is the centennial year. And I think it's to understand that 100 years later, you look at the settlement patterns of the United States and where people are living. And I think this map really helps to tell a very important story of the United States. So, can you as an AP student, can you tell the history of the United States through this map and explain why people are living where they're living? And especially, I think one of the patterns that I hope to illuminate by sharing this map to you is just how much of the United States was unsettled, how much of the United States had yet to have been touched, and how few frontier settlements actually existed west of the Mississippi, and especially west of Arkansas. And even look at your home state of Texas, the settlement patterns in your home state of Texas, and how do you account for this, right? How do we account for this? And so anyway, I think it's a very valuable map, and I think it really, again, 100 years into our history, it really helps to tell the story. As you know, where are we 100 years later? Here's another map showing frontier settlements from 1870 to 1890. The areas settled by 1870 are shaded green, by 1880 shaded orange, and of course by 1890, in red. And so it shows that even in a 20-year period, the extent of growth in settling the frontier areas, guys, not just in the New West, but I mean, you can see in areas in New York and upstate Maine and even well into Florida. I mean, it's expansion is definitely a very important phenomenon of the Gilded Age in moving into these areas. So what were the push-pull factors related to the settlement and development of the West? I mean, what drew people to the West? And so I gave you a number of examples you could use. One, of course, is the story of the pioneer moving to the Great Plains for farming or cattle ranching. Those are two very important economic enterprises happening. So many Easterners are going to move west for those two purposes. Two, the search for minerals. And of course, we can trace this, to the 1849 gold rush, and of course, in the 1850s, the discovery of the Comstock lode, which we will discuss later on. Three, the Civil War. The Civil War also inspired the settlement of the West because the need for food, the need for new farms out west, the need for raw materials for factories. And of course, during the Civil War, the North is going to encourage, the United States government is going to encourage people to move west. Industrialization, obviously the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War period the pre-Civil War period is going to continue through the Civil War and into the Gilded Age. And so with the rise of industry, it caused the need for raw materials, which the West, of course, would provide. So 5, outlaws moved west because of a lack of law enforcement. Religious groups are going to continue to move west in order to seek asylum from religious persecution. Really, number 7 and 8, I want to really emphasize this to you. These are two major developments. Immigration. There is a huge desire for labor. It's supposed to be land and labor. There's a huge desire for land and labor. A lot of immigrants, especially from Europe, are coming from Europe because Europe is crowded. There's not enough land in Europe for its poor. And so much of Europe's poor are going to immigrate to the United States because they're going to be lured by the availability of land. And of course, there's the West was viewed as a place of economic opportunity, and that drove a lot of immigrants west as well. Another phenomenon happening during the Gilded Age period is an intensive degree of urbanization. And the fact is, as we will learn in our urbanization unit, is that the cities were overcrowding. The cities were overcrowding in the East. And so newspaperman Horace Greeley famously said in the New York Tribune that the solution for the overcrowding of the cities was the West. And so he said, "Go west, young man." Right? So Many Americans are going to see the West as a solution to America's overcrowding problem and to America's poverty problem. And so this is one of your note card terms, and I'll introduce it now because I do not put this in your anywhere else in this presentation. It's called the safety valve theory. The safety valve theory is this idea that the West exists to relieve pressure of population growth and the problems of poverty, the problems of the cities, that the West served as a solution, as a remedy to the problems of the East. And of course, the big one is the building of the railroads, beginning with the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. This is a big thing happening during the Civil War. The U.S. Congress is going to pass the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. And 7 years later, the Transcontinental Railroad is constructed, linking Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. And beginning with the Transcontinental Railroad, the railroads is what really brought the people. Building the railroads made the people come. So another major concept I want every AP student to know in this unit, and I say it every year, every activity going on in the West is caused by forces and developments occurring in the East. All right, so whether it's immigration or industrialization, okay, but everything that's happening in the West, farming, ranching, mining, all these economic activities are connected to developments in the East. Okay, everything is connected to the East. So as we go through this, I want you to understand that. It's very important. Okay, so let's start with the Transcontinental Railroad here. Of course, this is a very famous photograph where the two lines are going to meet. You're going to have two railroad companies are going to be given the government contract to build the railroad, to build the Transcontinental Railroad. First is the Union Pacific. They started in Omaha, Nebraska, and they built westward. Okay, they relied largely on what were called paddies. Paddies is a term used to describe Irish workers. So they utilized cheap labor. They utilized cheap labor, and the cheap labor were the Irish. And the company was granted 20 square miles for each mile of track constructed. The U.S. government gave the railroad companies the land for free to build the railroads. There's a very famous AMC series called Hell on Wheels that is set in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. It's actually, I'm not through with that series yet on Netflix, but it's a pretty cool deal. As a history nerd, it's pretty cool. But so you got the Union Pacific Railroad building west, and then from the starting in California and building east is the Central Pacific Railroad. They started in Sacramento, and they were the company. Let me see if I can. Here we go. So they were the ones that had to cut through the mountains. So naturally, the number of miles that they constructed wasn't as much as the Union Pacific. But you can see right here at Promontory Point, Utah, the two lines are going to meet, and this is what this photo is. And of course, they had a ceremony there, the driving of the golden spike, the last spikes. There's the golden spike right here. The owner and the president of the Central Pacific Railroad is Leland Stanford. of Stanford fame, right? Stanford University. So Central Pacific Railroad relied on coolies, and that was Chinese labor. So they imported workers from China, and the Chinese worked for roughly $1 a day in building the railroads. And of course, the Sierra Nevada mountains became a major challenge as workers could only chip through a few inches a day through these rocky tunnels. Yeah, so the significance of the Transcontinental Railroad, it linked the entire continent via railroad and telegraph, paved the way for incredible growth of the West, facilitated a growing trade with the Orient, and allowed for the development of the three frontiers, which we will address here in a second. I think it's in classic Gilded Age style. This monumental feat didn't come without corruption. And so there was a scandal that that resulted from the building of the railroads, where the Credit Mobilier Construction Company pocketed $73 million. $73 million for $50 million worth of work. And along the way, the executives of the Credit Mobilier Construction Company are going to bribe congressmen to essentially look the other way as they overbuild the government in building the railroads. So I think it's also important to note that at the time, Americans considered the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad as perhaps the most important achievement in American history, probably dating back to the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. You know, the way I've described it before in class is that this would be like in my lifetime, in 1980, when we sent, I think it was 80, may have been 81 or 82. Anyway, may have been 82. Sorry. The sending into outer space, the first space shuttle. You know, I think at the time, Americans viewed the Space Shuttle Columbia, the first space shuttle flight, as perhaps one of the greatest accomplishments in American history. So that's I think in this era, this was considered to be one of the most important developments in American history. And there's the driving of the golden spikes. You can see the executives, all the congressmen, you know, the well-to-do, come out to the ceremony where they drive in the final spikes, commemorating. And as you can see here, I think it's important that as they're not only laying railroad, but they're laying telegraph lines too. Okay, telegraph lines too. So as the New West developed, there emerged three frontiers that lured Americans and immigrants. You got the mining, ranching. Oh my goodness, it's supposed to be farming frontier. I've got to fix that. The farming, mining, ranching, and farming. And with the construction of Western Railroad network, these frontiers were able to expand and grow, as the railroad also posed a serious threat to Native American culture. So we're going to start off with, I'm going to describe each of the frontiers. You're going to need to be familiar with the importance of the three frontiers. The first one is the mining frontier. The mining frontier, as you can see in the map, okay, you've got your gold mining, which is the light, the kind of the yellowish color. You've got your intermontane region, which is your gold, silver, copper, iron areas. New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada. Of course, this is the old Gadsden Purchase area, so kind of interesting. And then, of course, you have your Rocky Mountain region, which yielded gold, silver, lead, and copper. So you can see the geographic pattern of the mining locations of the mining operations. So where did it all begin? It began in 1849. The California miners of 1849 set the typical pattern in which the sudden, disorderly rush of prospectors to the new find was quickly followed by the arrival of the camp followers, a motley crew of peddlers, saloon keepers, prostitutes, card sharps, hustlers, and assorted desperadoes who were all out to mine the miners. I love that phrase, mine the miners. So generally, once gold was found in a place, within just a matter of a few days, that one place was filled with upwards of thousands of people, other prospectors, and other people who were there to make money off the miners. As I say, mine the miners. They were out to mine the miners. So then if the new field panned out, the forces of respectability and more subtle forms of exploitation slowly worked their way in. So ultimately these mining camps became cities, right? So you can look and you can see the different areas: Denver, Pikes Peak, Central City, Leadville. Leadville is a place where my wife and I we go just south of there every year to a music festival in Buena Vista, Colorado. But Leadville, of course, very very important lead mines. I hope they have good health insurance, because lead is not really good for you. You got Deadwood, Custer City, Virginia City, Helena, Butte, Montana up here is going to be a very prominent area of copper mining. So what we find is that in these frontier mining camps is that wherever you found finds, you had cities people flooded to by the thousands. But also you have these mining camps that where maybe perhaps the gold went dry or silver went dry, and so these towns would very quickly become ghost towns, and people would just simply uproot and leave and go to the next hotspot. Okay, so there was a lot of that. And it was in these mining camps that we see an era of lawlessness. Okay, there is no law in these mining camps, and so these were very dangerous places for people to live and to work. And eventually, with the absence of law and order, vigilante rule initially governed, and until stability was able to forge itself. As mining became more dependent on capital, the day of the individual prospector began to wane. The 49ers first got at all the gold by sifting off dirt, gravel through panning, or diverting a stream through a sluice box. Efficient mining eventually took a more mechanized means of extracting precious metals that were locked in quartz. So I think what's true about the development of the West, where you're talking about the mining, the ranching, or the farming, is that it initially started out as individuals working for themselves. And then over time, companies, large companies, are going to dominate these fields. Okay, and you'll see that tendency in these three frontiers. In the mining frontier, Chinese immigrants were imported to provide cheap labor in the big mining operations, as you can see in the picture. Between 1849 and 1853, 24,000 young Chinese men immigrated to California. By 1852, Chinese miners were required to pay a mining tax in order to engage in the activity. Chinese were often subjected to violence in the camps, and the legal system really afforded them very little protection. After the gold rush ended, the Chinese moved and became farm laborers, engaged in low-paying industrial jobs, and of course, as I mentioned before, worked on railroad construction. So here's some famous gold rushes. Obviously, we have the first California gold rush, the 49ers, as we call them. Then in 1850, I don't have this in chronological order, but then, of course, Colorado, You have along the South Platte River near Pikes Peak. You're going to have a total of 100,000 prospectors travel here. Most of them, of course, go bust. But because of the Pikes Peak gold rush, it led to the rapid development of Colorado. And by 1876, Colorado becomes a state. And of course, if you know anything about Colorado, its nickname is the Centennial State because it became a state on our 100th birthday as a country. The other, and I would probably put this as one of your more important gold rush, or it wasn't really a gold rush, but one of your most important rushes was in Gold Hill, Nevada. It's kind of misleading because there wasn't any gold in. It wasn't much of a gold find as it was a silver find in Nevada. So you've got the Comstock lode. This is a very important term. I introduced it earlier. Comstock lode includes large veins of gold and silver discovered by H.T.P. Comstock, a Canadian-born fur trapper. And within 20 years, the Comstock lode yielded $20 million in wealth. And by 1861, because of the large number of people moving into Nevada to become prospectors, Nevada became a territory. And by 1864, Nevada became the Silver State. Number 4, you've got the Black Hills in South Dakota. That's in 1874-75, located near a town called Deadwood, which consequently was a place where some of the most notorious desperados hung out, including the likes of Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and others. And of course, the Black Hills is going to be important because this is going to tie into the story of General George Armstrong Custer and the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. Okay. Then number 5, and of course, this is much later. This is at the very tail end of the Gilded Age. But you got the Yukon Gold Rush in Alaska, a find that was discovered by George Carmack, which will bring over 100,000 prospectors into Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. So the significance of the mining frontier is that it attracted people. Most people who went to look for gold or silver or copper or iron or lead failed. Very few people prospered. So the most important thing the mining frontier does in aiding in the development of the West is that it brought people. And as it brought people, it allowed for the rapid development of new territories and states. The mining frontier also provided raw materials for the industrial machine in the East. As you can see on the right here, there's a picture of a copper smelting plant in Butte, Montana. And so what's going on in the East is the introduction of electricity. So the Gilded Age is the age of Edison, Thomas Edison. So rapidly what's happening is electricity is very rapidly changing American life. It's influencing how Americans live, work, and play. And so with electricity, copper was extremely valuable. In fact, you can make the argument that iron and copper were the most important minerals of the Industrial Revolution. Not the gold and the silver, but the copper and iron are the two most important minerals of the Industrial Revolution. And the mining frontier, as I mentioned before, led to urbanization in the West, where old mining camps became boom towns, and some often became ghost towns. Of course, the most important city in the West during this era was San Francisco. San Francisco was tied to an increasing trade with the Orient and a thriving mining and railroad industries. Levi Strauss, of course, one of the great capitalists of, if you think about the Gilded Age as the age in which capitalism takes off in the United States, where individual entrepreneurs are going to take an idea and make a lot of money with that idea. Well, the West created millionaires. Mining created millionaires, and so one of these would be Levi Strauss. Levi Strauss made clothes for miners, for the workers, for the miners. Very durable. The denim was viewed to be very durable, to withstand just the rigor of the work, the toll that the work took on clothing. And of course, today, if you're talking about American, symbols, of America, of American culture, to me, there's no greater symbol than blue jeans. I mean, the United States gave the world blue jeans. And if you guys ever have time, I think this is such a great story. It was a story that I was actually fascinated with when I was your age, studying this stuff. And that's the story of the Cold War. It's the story of the Cold War. So I put a link to a story that I pulled it off the Levi's website, talking about the importance of the blue jeans during the Cold War, and how many young people living beyond the Iron Curtain and in the Soviet Union, that they just obsessed over blue jeans, and that the communists viewed blue jeans as a symbol of capitalism, of democracy. Blue jeans were a symbol of freedom. And so many young people living in the Eastern Bloc, and if you read the article, there's actual stories where young kids are defecting, and they're running away from home, and they're defecting and to the West, out of their desire to immerse themselves in Western culture. And Western culture includes wearing blue jeans. So this is I believe this picture is from 1989. This is the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in a small but unique and I think powerful way, blue jeans really helped young Eastern Europeans desire Western culture. Blue jeans were very, very popular beyond the Iron Curtain. The second frontier is the ranching frontier. And the ranching frontier is, says here, while the West was being taken from the Indians, cattle entered the grasslands where the buffalo had roamed, and the cowboy enjoyed his brief heyday. Fading then to folklore, the Wild West, along with the prospectors, the desperados, and the Plains Indians. So you can see here, this is also another very effective map, not only showing you the mining centers, but also by 1880, the various railroads that were being constructed. Of course, you have this is your Transcontinental Railroad here. You got your Union Pacific. There's Promontory Point here, the Central Pacific. You got what's called the Great Northern Railroad up here, built by God, I forget his last, G.H. Hill. Connects Duluth, Minnesota to Seattle. You got the Pacific, the Southern Pacific Railroad from Tacoma all the way down to LA. And then the Southern Pacific Railroad here from LA into San Antonio, right? And you can see in the red the various cattle trails going westward. And they're going westward to the railroads, right? They're going to the railroads. So before you had the railroads, you had the cattle trails, and that's where the cattle will be moved over great distances to be shipped back east. This became the beef industry became a huge industry during the Gilded Age out west. Cattle industry had its roots in the Mexican territory of Texas. going all the way back to the 1770s. Mexican cowboys called vaqueros rounded up wild steer and drove them into southern Texas. And much of the cowboy image, you think about the cowboy image you and I think of, was derived from Mexican or Spanish heritage, including the longhorn. The Texas Longhorn was introduced by Mexican cowboys. The saddle, the chaps, the spurs, cowboy hat, these are all derived from Mexicans. Texas cowboys adopted ranching styles and practices from the vaqueros as well, from the branding of animals to roping techniques. Cattle originally was not a very profitable industry until the railroad came. Okay, so beef was not so much an industry because in order for beef to enter American markets, cattle would have to be driven a long way. And so there is no really a beef industry until the railroads come. But beef became obviously extremely profitable and became very important back east because of the growing population. There was a need for food to feed a growing population. So by 1865, there were approximately 5 million head of cattle roaming freely throughout the Southwest. Right? And originally there were small markets for beef early on in the industry in places like New Orleans or Galveston, Austin, other cities in the Southwest, even in the gold mining communities in California, Colorado, and Nevada. So you see these old mining camps, right? So these were places where early beef thrived. So what caused the cattle industry to grow? Number one, increased demand for beef was high at the end of the Civil War. Prices ranged from $30 to $50 per head of Texas cattle. And this is why Texas is actually going to be one of the only former Confederate states not to have suffered economically during Reconstruction. Texas was able to shift away from, not totally from cotton, but they were able to shift from a cotton economy to cattle ranching. Secondly, Texans were also into oil too. We'll get into oil later on in the industrialization unit. Second cause for the cattle industry to grow were railroads. Okay, huge. I mean, by Clash, you cannot have the beef industry without the railroads. Railroads built in the West allowed for cattle drives to cow towns for transport to eastern markets. Examples of famous cow towns: Fort Worth. Most Texas cattle went through Fort Worth stockyards before being transported to other markets. Kansas City was the major center for transporting cattle by rail. These cow towns were also called railheads. So you see that term railhead. A railhead is a place where you load the cattle onto railroads where they're going to be shipped east to be slaughtered. The two major slaughterhouses, or what they call the packing industry in the United States, was in Chicago and New Orleans. Those are the two major areas. So that's where a lot of the railroad lines ended. And that's where a lot of the cattle will be unloaded. You'll learn that in The Jungle, when we're reading The Jungle. Then you got Dodge City. That's a famous railhead. Abilene, Kansas. Abilene, Kansas is located on the Kansas Pacific Railroad. Joseph McCoy turned Abilene into one of the first great cow towns. And it was located on the northern end of the Chisholm Trail, where Texas cattle will be driven northward to Abilene and then moved by rail to Chicago, where they had a thriving cattle industry. Okay. So here you see the Chisholm Trail going all the way from South Texas through San Antonio to Abilene, where then it makes its way to Chicago. Okay. So who did these cattle drives? Well, we'll get to that in a second. So expansion of the railroads and the breeding of tougher varieties of cattle caused the cattle industry to boom. Eventually, other trails would be built to new railheads and cattle towns in Montana and Wyoming. Cattle towns rivaled mining camps for their lawlessness. So if you watch an old Western, you will see that in a lot of these cow towns, we have on one end of town, we have what are called boot hills. These were makeshift little cemeteries where they called them boot hills because often the graves were so shallow that the boots would stick up out of the ground. So these were the mining camps in these cow towns were places of they're very dangerous places. A lot of murders, a lot of shootouts, a lot of outlaws were active in these areas. Very high crime rate. So who engaged in the cattle drives? They're the cowboys. 20 years after the Civil War, some 40,000 cowboys roamed the Great Plains. They were young. The average age was 24. They came from diverse backgrounds. So when you get your image of the cowboy, okay, get out of your head Clint Eastwood or John Wayne or what you see in the old Westerns. 30% of cowboys were Mexican or African American. Hundreds were Indians. Many others were Civil War veterans from North and South who now rode side by side, consequently. And many cowboys actually were Europeans. Being a cowboy or ranch hand was hardly exciting. It was equivalent to being a laborer in the industrial East. So, yes, we romanticize the cowboy. A lot of young men want to grow up to be cowboys. They love the cowboy lifestyle. But what they understand is that the cowboy lifestyle was grueling. It was dirty work for very low wages. It was often very boring work. Drudgery and boredom was a big part of that lifestyle. I think in today's pop culture, the series Yellowstone, I think, is a great example, where you have these cowboys who work for very, very wealthy and very powerful ranchers, and they work for very low pay. They're not very well compensated, and oftentimes the work they do is from sun up till sundown, and it's very, very difficult. You can see a picture here of one of the activities that cowboys would routinely engage in, and this is the cattle branding. So the way you brand cattle is a means of recording and keeping track of your property, because in many times, especially prior to the barbed wire fences, ranching was done on the open range. There were no fences to keep the cattle from wandering off, and that's why the cowboys were necessary. They were necessary in order to manage the cattle on the open range. That's called open range ranching. Now, there's a term that comes out of the West. It's called the maverick. The term maverick. You got the Dallas Mavericks. It's an NBA team, and you got to think about what is a maverick. The term maverick actually comes from a Texas rancher by the name of Samuel Maverick, who had a reputation for not branding his cattle. And so if you were to ever come across cattle without a brand, it was alleged to be the property of Samuel Maverick. And so other local ranchers, rival ranchers, often considered Samuel Maverick to be a maverick. A maverick is someone who doesn't really follow the rules, someone who just kind of does his own thing. And so that's so usually when you call someone a maverick, it's someone who's very they kind of do their own thing. They're kind of rebellious. Hence, Top Gun. Tom Cruise's character in Top Gun, his call sign is Maverick, and that's the way he flew his jet. Is he didn't really conform well to the rules of engagement. So, what killed the cowboy away? Of course, the flush times the cow town would soon fade away, and many Cowboys would eventually revert to sleepy villages and occasional boot hills as reminders of the hell roaring times. So what killed the cowboy way were the long cattle drives. They declined because they're very expensive. The cattle drive is very expensive. Became economically unsound. The trail was danger. I mean, you're constantly, if you go back and look, the trails, I mean, you're going across Indian territory, very hostile territory. So you're constantly having to deal with Indians. You're having to deal with bandits and other desperados. Okay, so it was very dangerous work. Cattle drives were very hard. A lot of wear and tear on cowboys and the cattle. Advance of farms across the trails. So the trails eventually, are going to disappear. So the cattlemen eventually become convinced that railroads were the best means to transport cattle. Two, this is very important. What killed the cowboy was barbed wire. It ended the open range. And with the open range gone, then you don't really need, with the cattle drives gone, and with the open range gone, then the barbed wire is actually going to do the work of the cowboy. They're going to keep the cattle from wandering off. And so the barbed wire was first demonstrated in San Antonio, believe it or not, in Alamo Plaza by John Gates. It was invented by Joseph Glidden, demonstrated by John Gates in San Antonio. He claimed that it was, quote, light as air, stronger than whiskey, and cheaper than dirt. And he claimed that even the meanest longhorns would shy away from the wire. And so it was the barbed wire which eventually not only closes off the frontier, but ended open range ranching, really changed the West. Here's an advertisement for barbed wire fencing. So now the farming frontier, okay, the third frontier. Among the legendary figures of the West, the sod busters, which is a name that we give to the people you see in the picture here, because you see their home is made of sod. Because of the lack of trees, they built their homes out of earth. So they'd have to cut into the earth, cut into the sod, and use it as to build homes, right? So among the legendary figures of the West, the sodbusters projected an unromantic image in contrast to the miners and the cowboys, the cavalry and the Indians. So this was not, so of the three frontiers, the farming frontier was the hardest. There was no glamour in it. Farming had always, I don't care where you're at, whether you're in the East or the West, the North or the South, no matter where you're at, farming has always been considered a risky and arduous endeavor. And it was even more so on the Great Plains because of the unforgiving environment. So the government during the Civil War actually is going to encourage Western settlement, the creation of new farms. This is through the Homestead Act, 1862, where a farmer could realize the dream of free land by simply staking a claim of 160 acres, living on it for 5 years, and making improvements. Or they could buy the land at $1.25 an acre after 6 months. And so the problem is the land was so arid that it required double the amount of land in order to make it profitable. So 160 acres really isn't enough land to be profitable. So the Homestead Act did, very significant in getting thousands and thousands of Americans to stake claims of land in the West, but it wasn't enough land to be profitable. Okay, there were other laws. I'm really not concerned that you understand that the next two laws, but these are other government acts aimed at encouraging settlers to remake the landscape, to settle the landscape, the timber, of course, to encourage settlers to plant trees. And of course, that third one, the Desert Land Act, a way to entice settlers from moving into the most arid places in the West. So what kind of people took their chances in farming? One group famous group, this is a note card term, exodusters. These are African-American farmers from the South who immigrate after the war to settle in Kansas. And there were, by 1879, there were 15,000 poor Southern blacks in Kansas, taking up the life of a sodbuster. I provided a picture of a exoduster family. Of course, exoduster, the root word is Exodus. Exodus is from the Bible. The Exodus is the Moses leaving Egypt and going into the Promised Land. And so this is the exoduster. It's kind of has that biblical reference of leaving the South and moving to the West to live in freedom. 2, migrants. Attracted by free land, Europe was crowded, lured by railroad companies. So much of the farming frontier is going to be settled by immigrants. 3, by honest business people and swindlers. Former Civil War soldiers, land speculators, and the sons and daughters of Eastern farmers. But overwhelmingly, the sodbusters were Eastern farmers and very, very few city dwellers. Okay, very, very few city dwellers. So what were the struggles on the farm? You're going to need to be familiar with the struggles of the farmer during the Gilded Age. The first struggle is going to be water issues. I'd say this is probably one of the most important issues they had to constantly struggle. The West was simply too arid, and oftentimes ranchers dominated water rights. Okay, so water is a big issue. In fact, I'd say in many areas, water was the most valuable resource in the West. 2, even though the land was relatively cheap, horses, livestock, fencing, wagons, wells, seed, fertilizers were not. So what impoverished farmers was not the price of purchasing land or buying land. Buying land was actually the easiest part. What impoverished farmers was what was the other things, the other commodities, the other materials needed to farm. 3, freight rates and interest rates. So you got your railroad companies and your banks, okay? The freight rates and interest rates on loans helped create a new class of indebted farmers. So the Western farmer is one of the huge struggles they face is debt. And oftentimes it's the railroads overcharging them and the banks overcharging them when it comes to interest rates on whatever loans that these farmers take out to buy horses, to buy livestock, to buy wagons. The loans were very, very expensive. Another challenge of farming in the West is that the land was virgin land. It was very, very hard. It was very hard to break the earth, and it oftentimes broke equipment. And because wood was scarce, pioneer families had to rely on burning dried buffalo dung for heat during the awful blizzards in the winters of the Great Plains. In the Great Plains, 6 homes were made of sod. That couldn't have been great. Farmers had to endure harsh elements, tornadoes, hailstorms, prairie fires, blizzards, and pests, always dealing with insects, harming their crops. You think about tornadoes, Kansas is known as Tornado Alley. Think about The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is actually set in the 1890s. And so you think about the challenges that Dorothy and her family are experiencing during the Gilded Age. And of course, tornadoes. And of course, number 8, it was lonely out there. Farmers lived in isolation and later would be remedied by farmer meetings, church dinners, and county fairs. So people lived in isolation, and it's isolation can drive a person crazy. Women, what impact did women have? Did farming have on women? And I'm going to argue, class, this is a big part of women's history, a big change in the Gilded Age with women. Out west, survival on the frontier required men and women to be equal partners. So there is a sense of a strong degree of equality between men and women out west. Back east is where you have the cult of domesticity. Number two, women assumed total control of their farms after the untimely deaths of their husbands. And it was very common to have farms being run by women because of their husbands, or by single women, by widowed women, because of the deaths or absence of a husband. Number three, women in the West were more independent than those living back east. I've got a couple of really great quotes here that really help exemplify what's happening with gender and women and the roles of women during this era, especially out west. So letter A, says one woman declared that she insisted on leaving out the phrasing about obeying her husband from their marriage vows. Quote, I had served my time of tutelage to my parents, as all children are supposed to. I was a woman now, and capable of being the other half of the head of my family. Another feisty Kansas woman remarked, quote, the outstanding fact is that the environment was such as to bring out and develop the dominant qualities of individual character. Kansas women of that day learned at an early age to depend on themselves, to do whatever work there was to be done, and to face danger when it must be faced, as calmly as they were able. Their goal, she added, was to carve out a new world, to develop from wild prairie to comfortable homes. So you can say that the feminist movement was stronger and finds its origin in the West. I love that image. So I thought the Great American Desert was unlivable. That the climate and the soil and the conditions and the environment made it nearly impossible for white civilization to thrive, made farming nearly impossible. Well, that was true for a certain period of time, for much of American history up to this point. But what changed the West was technology. And what changed the Great American Desert into the breadbasket was technology advances. Okay, it made life and work easier and better in the plains. So I gave you some examples of technology, from dry farming techniques to irrigation projects. Dams or rivers are going to be dammed up where water is going to be preserved. I love number three. Three is a big one. A new variety of Russian wheat was introduced to the plains. It grew in a variety of climates and required less water. So a new strain of Russian wheat was introduced. John Deere steel plow was able to handle the tough virgin soil of the Midwest, but it was expensive. These plows, and this is what impoverished farmers. The technology is what really caused a lot of their debt issues. James Oliver introduced the chilled plow, which is known as the sod buster. Much, much cheaper. So other technologies like the threshing machines, like a harvester. It's a harvester for like wheat. Hay mowers, planters, manure spreaders, cream separators also improve the quality of work on the farms. And with technology, I'll say this, you could be a family farmer and you could own 300 acres. And this technology made it possible for you to have such a large farm, but yet a family farm where you and your family could manage. You didn't need a lot of labor. The technology is going to replace the labor. So there is also other farming beyond the plains. California, for example, is the second leading producer of wheat in the nation at that time. They also had a large wine and grape industry near San Fran. It's also one of the largest, and it still is today. In fact, I think I read somewhere that it actually eclipses Florida as the largest citrus producer in the country, producing such crops as oranges, limes, lemons, grapefruits, and avocados. Debates between miners and farmers over water use prompted the formation of irrigation districts to oversee the use of water in California. So out west, I think just understand that there is this competition for water between farmers and ranchers and other industries out west. There is a huge competition for water. You also have a thriving timber industry in places like Washington, Oregon, and California, where they would have what were called log drives, where they would chop down trees and then send the logs down rivers to the lumber mills. And at the lumber mills, they would turn these trees, the timber, into finished products. You also, as I mentioned earlier, in all three frontiers, all three frontiers are eventually going to be dominated by very wealthy interests. And in the farming industry, in the farming frontier, we have what are called bonanza farms. And the first bonanza farm, these are these large factory farms, farm factories. Okay, I use that, look at this term, farm factory or corporate farms. Okay, so these are a good example today. Like so much of our food today, when you go to the grocery store and you look at who makes our food today, who grows the wheat, who produces the corn, who like when you get your Thanksgiving turkey. If you get your Thanksgiving turkey, you're basically buying from probably one of four companies. You know, the idea of the family farmer today is dying. I think I read somewhere that of all the farms today, less than 10% of farms today are family owned. It's approximately 90% of farms and ranches in this country are actually controlled by very wealthy corporate interests. And so we call these large farm operations bonanza farms. Oliver Dalrymple started the first one in Minnesota. These large-scale farmers focused usually on one crop. One farm in North Dakota, for example, one bonanza farm, you had 13,000 acres of wheat in a single field. Okay. Look at this quote here. It says, "You are in a sea of wheat," a bedazzled visitor wrote in 1880. Quote, "The railroad train rolls through an ocean of grain. We encountered a squadron of war chariots doing the work of human hands." War chariots are like harvesters, technology harvesters, doing the work of human hands. There are about 25 of them in this one brigade of the Grand Army of 115. So there's 115 harvesters under the marshalship of this Dakota farmer. Another bonanza farm employed over 1,000 migrant workers to tend 30,000 acres in the Dakotas, located in the Dakotas. Bonanza farms were corporate farms that lowered costs due to the economy of scale. It resulted in cheaper shipping rates provided by railroads. Seed, fertilizer were sold to them at discounted rates. And they benefited from the introduction of machinery to the farm. And they grew. Eventually, bonanza farms are going to grow and intervene into areas dominated by small farmers. Small farmers resented the bonanzas, felt like they undersold them, and feared that corporate interest would eventually outproduce them. So what small farmers did that the bonanzas couldn't do is they had to diversify their crops. Okay, they diversified their crops to compete with the bonanza farms. But the problem of becoming a farmer in the West is that in order to start up a homestead, it required a minimum of $1,000 in investments just to start up a farm. And so regardless of who you are, if you're starting up a new farm, you're starting off in debt. Second bullet, while the overall value of the farmlands and farm products increased in the late 19th century, the small farmer did not keep up with the march of progress. So even though farm prices are going up, all right, and the value of their products are going up, the debts are increasing. It's very, very difficult for the farmer. His numbers grew, but decreased in proportion to the population at large. Wheat, like cotton, during the antebellum period, provided the great export crop which evened Americans' balance of payments and spurred economic growth. So wheat, really becomes the premier crop during the Civil War. Cotton, you're going to see a major decline in cotton production. But for a variety of reasons, a few small farmers prospered, and they increasingly grew dependent on manufacturing, rail, and banking interests. But something was amiss. Farmers began to reason, and by the end of the decade, by the 1890s, they were in open revolt against the system of corrupt middlemen and average bankers who they believed conspired against them. So during the Gilded Age period, Western farmers are going to engage in political activism. So you take all the problems that they're facing. Okay, remember they play the blame game. They blame the manufacturers. They blame for making products that are so expensive. They blame the bankers because of the predatory loans. They don't like the bonanzas, right? So they're angry, right? So there are two organizations that are going to be founded that farmers are going to flood to, and they're going to become very politically active. The first one is called the Grange. Okay, the National Grange, founded by Oliver Kelly, reached a peak membership of 1.5 million members. It started originally it started as a social club, a place where lonely, isolated farmers can go and hang out. The Grange often hosted barbecues, supposed to be square dances. Man, I got a lot of typos. Square dances and hoedowns. But eventually it became very political. It started off as a social and educational organization and eventually became very political. And eventually their chief goal, and I want you to know this about the Grange, was the regulation of railroad rates. They were tired of getting screwed over by the railroad companies, of being overcharged. As a result of their activism, 5 states are going to pass what were called Granger laws, aimed at regulating the railroads. And though they were relatively ineffective, it did lay the foundation for stronger legislation to follow. Eventually, these Granger laws, will be challenged in the courts. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1877 in Munn versus Illinois that the states can regulate railroads in the interest of the public. Okay, in the interest of the public. In any interest where the public has an interest, the states can govern, can regulate these railroad companies. But eventually, again, this ruling was watered down, and later courts would severely restrict the ability of states to regulate these railroads. The second organization is called the Farmers Alliance. So as the Granger movement waned, the Farmers Alliance took their place. So the Farmers Alliance had thousands of chapters spread out throughout the South and the West. They also believed in collective political action. So think of it like a union. You have unions in the North, unions of coal miners, unions of railroad workers. But this is a union of farmers. They believed that collective action was a way to seek relief from the hardships created by chronic indebtedness, declining prices, and devastating droughts. It also fostered a sense of community for many isolated, struggling farmers and families. Alliance gatherings resembled spiritual camp meetings. One observer described an alliance meeting as, quote, a religious revival, a Pentecost, in which the tongue of flame sat upon every man, and each spake as the Spirit gave him utterance. The alliance movement was attractive to women and men alike. Alliances welcomed rural white women and men over the age of 16 who displayed good moral character, believed in God, and demonstrated industrious habits. It allowed women to emerge from traditional domesticity. So the Farmers Alliance enabled for political activism among women. Okay, as one publication, by the way, the Alliance had upwards of almost 1,000 newspapers or 1,000 newsletters. Okay, so one of these publications said, quote, the Alliance has come to redeem woman from her enslaved condition and place her in her proper sphere. And in the Alliance, in the Farmers Alliance, many women actually are going to assume key leadership roles. Okay, so new topic, we're talking about the Indian War. So one of the important developments of the New West. In fact, one of the most important topics of the New West is that as we start to see the growth of these three frontiers, you're going to see conflicts between Americans and American culture and Native American culture. So, gave you some general causes of the conflict between the U.S. government and the Native Americans. One being white intrusion on Indian lands, the building of the railroads. Look, the Indians, they weren't stupid. I mean, they understood that the building of the railroads were likely not going to be very good for them. That it was going to bring more white people into their lands, that they're constantly going to have encroachments on their hunting grounds. So as the railroads were being built, the Indians began to attack railroad workers. And as the Indians began to attack the railroad workers, then the U.S. government is going to send in cavalry units, are going to send in the U.S. Army to protect the railroad workers. So by building the railroads, you're actually bringing to the West, you're bringing troops. You bring the U.S. military. So cause the development of three frontiers, violation of treaties, and of course efforts to assimilate Native Americans to white culture. So there's three major battles, three major incidents. Of course, there's many to choose from, but there's three in APUSH that I want you to be familiar with. In fact, for your exam, I want you to know one of these very well. I'm not really worried about you knowing all three, but just know them all. Know one very well, but superficially, we need to know them all. So really one of the first major events, developments in the Indian Wars, happened in June of 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn. I did attach a document I want you to read. I did put it on your reading list. It tells you the story of Little Bighorn. But just to summarize it, in 1874, General George Armstrong Custer accompanied a group of miners into the Black Hills of South Dakota to protect them from Indian raids. This action encroached upon the hunting grounds of the Sioux Indians, and Custer had previously promised the Sioux that he would keep the miners out, but he did little to protect the Sioux hunting grounds. So what you have is you got white intrusion into Sioux hunting grounds that have been promised them by the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And I put a copy of the Treaty of Fort Laramie so you can read. It's not mandatory, but it's pretty interesting. So by protecting the miners in the Black Hills, Custer is in violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Eventually these natives, these Sioux, and the Lakotas, they began to attack the miners, and eventually Custer is going to be ordered to move against these wandering bands of Sioux hunting parties. He found the remaining encampment of Sioux and Cheyenne allies encamped on the Little Bighorn River. See the Little Bighorn River here. There's their little camp, okay, on the Little Bighorn River. Separated from the main body of men, Custer and a detachment of 200 men were surrounded by a body of warriors numbering 2,500 strong. He and his men were completely annihilated in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. The Sioux chief, Sitting Bull, eventually fled to Canada and was eventually captured, and the other Indian general responsible for Custer's Last Stand, Crazy Horse, was eventually captured and murdered by his guard. So the importance of the Battle of Little Bighorn, why is it so important? Because when people back home, back east, back in Washington, D.C., learned of Custer's death, it created this impulse to get revenge. Okay, and it also heightened tensions between the government, and not just the Sioux, but basically all Native American tribes. There's gold hair here. Custer, I think we can obviously I could talk about Custer for days. We don't have my whole lot of time. This is already going to be a long presentation. But Custer is no doubt today, I think, a notorious and infamous person. Here's Sitting Bull, and we'll learn more about Sitting Bull later on in the presentation. Then you got the Sand Creek Massacre. And again, I put an account of the Sand Creek Massacre. I included a link to it. But this dealt with the massacre, the killing and the mutilation of about upwards of 500 Native Americans by U.S. Army forces in Colorado. By Colonel John Chivington. And about 2/3 of the victims were women and children. So in 1865, a congressional committee began to collect evidence on the grisly Indian wars and massacres, and in 1867 issued a report on the condition of the Indian tribes. And this, of course, led to an act establishing an Indian Peace Commission. The goal of the commission would be to end American wars with the Indians and removing the causes of the wars. And following this report, peace treaties were signed with various tribes. And you can just read through this, and you can see there's a number of tribes that are either going to sign treaties with the government or during the period are going to be defeated by U.S. Army forces. And whether it's the Blackfoot, the Crow, the Modocs, the Utes, and of course the story of the Nez Perce, who attempted to escape the United States. They went on a 1,500-mile retreat and were eventually captured 30 miles from the Canadian border, and they were all forced onto reservations in Oklahoma. And so the chief of the Nez Perce is Chief Joseph. And Chief Joseph went to Washington, D.C., and he testified on behalf of his people and all Native peoples. And I put a copy of that speech there. I think it's very important to read that. But in a separate document in his surrender, prior to his surrender to U.S. forces, he said, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before, I have it in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tahu Shoot is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led on the young men is dead. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, and perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more. I will fight no more forever." This sad, 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 sad. Then you got Geronimo. Apache Chief Geronimo is going to be captured. One of the last Indian tribes to be subdued by the U.S. Army, captured on the New Mexico-Arizona border, ending the government's war with that tribe. And the last conflict in this grisly Indian war was the Battle of Wounded Knee. You have an assignment on this topic, so I'm not going to go too crazy into it. But eventually, in 1890, the Sioux began to believe that by engaging in a ritual called the ghost dance, that it would bring about a Messiah, and they believed that a Messiah was going to come and to rescue the Indians and to restore their lands. And so they began to participate in this ghost dance, right? And the white soldiers at Wounded Knee, the Wounded Knee is a reservation, okay, where And there were neighboring reservations. Rosebud was another reservation. This is where the Sioux are going to be relegated. And there are other tribes that are in the area. And they were being treated very poorly by the government. The promise of rations, equipment, food, doctors, I mean, all these essentials that were promised, the U.S. government was very neglectful on these reservations. Well, in 1890, the Sioux took it up with such fervor, talking about the ghost dance, that it alarmed the white authorities. And an effort to arrest Sitting Bull led to his death, and shortly afterward, on December 29th, 1890, a bloodbath at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. An accidental rifle discharge led nervous soldiers to fire into a group of Indians who had come to surrender. Nearly 200 Indians and 25 soldiers died in what has been known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. And so the Indian Wars had ended with characteristic brutality. So this is the very last struggle, and it really wasn't much of a struggle. One of the questions I ask students every year is, was Wounded Knee a battle or was it a massacre? From the Indians' point of view, it was a massacre. From the soldiers' point of view, it was a battle. So it's again, there's an assignment on this. I'm not going to go too crazy into it. So the collapse of Indian resistance is linked to the killing of the buffalo. And I included an account, a white hunter's account of shooting the buffalo. Of course, the whites had technological advantage of the telegraph, the railroad, the Colt revolver, and defeating the Indians. You can see here, I included this image because this was very, very common, where for sport, men would kill buffalo while riding trains for their bodies to rot. General Philip Sheridan, he's one of the famous Indian generals, Indian hunters during this era, famously said, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." And he was correct. And their corpses were left rotting in the prairie fields. Millions and millions of head of buffalo are going to be decimated. Their hides are going to be taken to be sold. This is a pile of 40,000 buffalo hides waiting to be shipped on trains. This is Dodge City, Dodge City, Kansas. So, what to do with the natives? Congress passed a law called the Dawes Severalty Act. I actually gave you a link to the law. It's actually one of our readings we need to do. The law reflected forced civilization views of reformers. They've thought that it was the most humane thing to do to the Native Americans is to assimilate them to a white culture. And so what the Dawes Severalty Act did, it did a number of things. It, one, dissolved tribes as legal entities. It ended tribal ownership of land. And it assimilated American Indians by turning them into farmers, by giving them allotments of land up to 160 acres and introducing the Indians to breaking them of their nomadic way of life, breaking them of their hunter-gatherer way of life, and to force them to become farmers. You can see this cartoon here shows you this effort of the United States government to assign each individual Native American family its own plot of land. That was a way of breaking the bonds of the Indians to their tribal lands. If American Indians, quote unquote, behaved like good white settlers, they would get full title to their holdings and citizenship in 25 years. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established for taking care of Native Americans on the reservation. So oftentimes this land is located in reservation territory. They're going to be relegated to reservations where they're to be cared for by the U.S. government. So I put a link to Chester A. Arthur's, this is before the Dawes Act, but he's basically outlining what eventually is going to be in the Dawes Severalty Act. Okay, so an important exercise I'd like for us to do, and this is part of our homework as well, is to hit that document. Okay, so I put a link to it right here. You can see the reservations scattered throughout the West, and the whites that were transferred from Indians to the whites. And I think an important topic is the Carlisle, this effort of assimilation. And of course, we're going to target young kids, young Indian kids. Schools like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was established. This one was in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, established by Richard Henry Pratt. The school strove to immerse its students in mainstream Euro-American culture, believing that they might become able to advance themselves and thrive in the dominant society, white society. Pratt's slogan was to kill the Indian, but save the man. The way that you save Native Americans is that you've got to extinguish every bit of its culture from them. Carlisle and similar schools remain deeply controversial. They force children to leave their families at young ages, giving up their indigenous cultures, languages, religious and spiritual beliefs, and even their names, thus doing untold psychological damage to generations of Native people. Here's an image of the Carlisle School. Here's a before and after. Same three kids. 2/3 of American Indians, of Native Americans remaining, their land was lost. 1880, 1892, land rushes took Cherokee and Creek and other lands. So even the lands that they were promised on the reservation, much of those lands are going to be seized. It won't be until 1924 that Native Americans finally receive full citizenship. So a lot of the promises made by the U.S. government were never really carried out in full faith. One example of seizures of Indian lands was the Oklahoma land rush in April of 1889. U.S. government's going to make available to settlers vast stretches of land formerly occupied by Creeks and Seminoles in Oklahoma. And nearly 100,000 boomers, or what were called 89ers, poured in across the Oklahoma border. And by the end of the day, nearly 2 million acres of Native American land had been taken, had been settled. And by year's end, Oklahoma had 60,000 inhabitants, where Congress, of course, will eventually make it into a territory. In 1907, it became the Sooner State. And the name of those whites that seized the land in this land grab, in the land rush, they were nicknamed Sooners. So that's where the nickname Sooners comes from. There's an image. The race to stake a claim. Here it says Oklahoma or bust. People flooding. Guys, this is 1889. So this is like if you're a white man, this is your last opportunity to get free land. This is your last, but it's not free. It's not even yours. It belongs to the Native Americans. I thought I had a link. Okay, yeah. There's a video showing the Oklahoma land grab, the Sooners. Of course, after the war, after all this is over, Geronimo became a circus. literally part of a circus where for 25 cents or maybe for 5 cents, you can go into a tent and you can see Geronimo. So they became like little props that, I don't know how to, can't think of the word, but Geronimo and other Indian leaders are going to be paraded around the East, people paying 5-cent tickets to catch a glimpse of Geronimo. Look at the advertisement here. Pawnee Bill's Wild West Show. It says Geronimo. They put him right in the middle. It says, General Mills says, quote, the worst Indian that ever lived. Cost the U.S. government over $1 million to capture him. Right? So just how they build him and how they described him. Then you had Buffalo Bill Cody. He also had a show, kind of like a circus show, where Sitting Bull became, again, for a 5-cent ticket, you can go and see the notorious Sitting Bull. Now, there is a reformer by the name of Helen Hunt Jackson who wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor. It's the Uncle Tom's Cabin of Native Americans. It did for Native Americans what Uncle Tom's Cabin did for slaves. She wrote it in an attempt to change the government's ideas and policies towards Native Americans. She sent a copy of her book to every member of Congress with the hope of awakening the conscience of the American people and their representatives to the flagrant wrongs that have been done to the American Indians. And to bring closure to this unit, the census of 1890 revealed for the first time in American history the absence of frontier, or the closing of the frontier. It was all gone. This census is huge, class. It's big because, first of all, it prompted Turner to produce his thesis. Secondly, it signaled to farmers that the grim prospect of acquiring new land was another typo. There was a grim prospect of acquiring new land. You also had around about this time this theory called the organic theory is taking hold among intellectuals. This idea that if a country is not expanding, like geographically, then you're exploding. So Americans began to panic. What's going to happen now that we've run out of frontier? The United States, they believed that if we stop expanding, then our economy is going to explode. Like it's going to do us in. And of course, because of this, it encouraged a shift to a more imperialistic foreign policy aimed at gaining more territory overseas. Well, this ends our unit lecture on the New West. Thank you.